Hey, I'm Daniel, and I've got a story that'll leave you gripping the edge of your seat. My wife, Vi, and we've been through hell and back. She had this secret, this massive affair with my own brother, Mark, that shook our world to the core. It's a tale of betrayal, lies, and a love that somehow survived it all. If you're intrigued by the tangled webs we weave and want more stories that'll have you saying no way, hit that subscribe button and join us for a roller coaster of emotions. Welcome to our channel, where every tale is a punch in the gut. Little Bradley lay propped up in the hospital bed in her master bedroom. The long stream of visitors had finally ended and she was left with only her immediate family. She sighed deeply, adjusting her body to lessen the continuous pain. It was still manageable with the current medication, but that time was quickly coming to an end. The simple fact was that she was dying. The doctors had sent her home with hospice, saying it would be just a week or two before. The pain would require stronger medication, which would make her incoherent and cause her to sleep most of the time. If she needed to get her life in order, now was the time to do it. She looked over at her husband of 28 years, her eyes filling with tears, as she thought of the pain she was about to inflict. Again, she questioned the wisdom of what she was about to do for her to leave this world in peace. However, she needed to tie up some loose ends. She had spoken with all the friends and family who would stop by to say goodbye. Now only those closest to her were still there. Daniel, her husband, still hovered over her in the room, while she could hear Sophia, her little sister, and Ryan and Eva, her niece and nephew, in the living room. Confession was supposedly good for the soul. Eva certainly hoped it would be, even though it would be painful. She knew she couldn't die with so many secrets hanging over her. She prayed they'd forgive her sweetheart. She said softly, her voice full of emotion. Yeah. Babe, he said, the concern on his face, making what she had to do even harder. He saw her tears and quickly went to her side. Is it the pain? He asked softly. She nodded and looked up into his gentle green eyes. Yes, but right now it's not the illness, Daniel. It's my heart that's breaking. He looked at her strangely, an odd look on his face. She gathered herself and continued, Dear, I need to tell you some things that'll be hard to hear. Actually, I'm not strong enough to do this twice, so it would be better if I did this only once. Would you ask Sophia to join us, Daniel? Questioning face slowly morphed into a deeply concerned one. Ava, he said quietly but with an evident underlying dread. What are you doing? What are you doing, sweetheart? I'm trying to set things right. I can't leave this world with the heavy burden I've kept hidden. Now please could you get Sophia? He nodded and then went into the living room. She could hear the muffled voices. Can I really tell them everything? She questioned herself. Can I break the hearts of those? I love the things she needed to say would hurt, but there was no other way to clear her conscience. She considered writing farewell letters, but it seemed cowardly. No, she'd hold her head up and confess what needed to be said. Her sins seemed like they occurred a lifetime ago, but she knew they'd altered so many lives. It had begun 20 years ago, a simple slip that snowballed into something much larger. Daniel traveled on business a great deal during the early years of their marriage. As a mid-level engineer in a construction firm, he'd been sent to oversee one remote building site after another. As he gained more experience and seniority, his traveling decreased to only short visits to major construction sites. It was just the opposite. For Ava, she'd initially traveled very little for work. However, before being diagnosed with cancer, Ava had spent the last 15 years traveling extensively around the world. As a senior trainer for a large corporation, she'd flown all the world training their on-site technical support staff. Ava smiled, thinking of the respect and praise she'd earned over the past years. She was very good at her job and had been well recognized and compensated. She had become the successful, strong, independent woman she'd always dreamed of being. 20 years earlier, she certainly wasn't those things. She'd been a woman who had recently turned 32 and was fighting off the occasional loneliness found in most career marriages. That's when she'd fallen Ava grindy, remembering how she tried justifying her past actions. Daniel traveling, her loneliness, the frustration at her, then floundering career, they were all factors but were only excuses. Daniel had been a good husband, even a great one, except for the traveling. There wasn't a doubt in her mind that she loved him and had for the past 28 years. He was 2 years younger than she was, and he'd always joked she liked younger men. He never knew how right he was. They had been married only 3 years when she'd been introduced to Mark. From the moment they first met, there was an intense spark between them. Even though he was 5 years her junior, where Daniel was good-looking and fit, Mark was ruggedly handsome and very muscular. They'd been drawn to each other from that very moment. She hadn't been looking to have an affair other than the loneliness. She'd been very happy with her marriage, but the thought of Mark's kisses and arms around her made her heart race and body ache with desire. There was another huge reason for them not to get together. Besides her being married, Mark was Sophia's fiancé. "You stupid fool," Ava chided herself. What kind of woman does that to her own sister? It was a question she'd asked herself countless times over the years. The answers she'd found were too painful to dwell on. Ava had always been the dominant older sister. There had been many times growing up when Sophia's adoration of her older sister had closely resembled idol worship. Where Ava was gregarious and outgoing, Sophia was more shy and reserved. Both sisters were attractive and tended to draw lots of male attention, even though the types of guys each one attracted differed. That was why Mark had caught her by surprise. She had resisted her draw to him for several months. Then Daniel was sent to Arizona for a very large construction project. He spent the next 3 months there, only returning home for a couple of days every 3 weeks. It was during that window she succumbed to. Mark was like her in that he was a corporate ladder climber. He was confident and aggressive, and he drew her to him like a moth to a flame. Ava scolded herself, remembering at the time she knew she was falling for Mark but was still in love with Daniel. The turmoil she struggled with then was nothing compared to the terror she felt when she found out she was pregnant. She panicked. She and Daniel had only had sex a handful of times during the probable window of conception, and she thought they'd always used precautions. She remembered using protection with Mark as well, but the frequency with her lover had been 10 times more than with her husband. Also, there had been several times the intimacy with Mark had been so passionate that the protection had broken. She was certain the child wasn't Daniel, and that fear led her to abruptly break off her affair with Mark. Still, as guilt-ridden as was, the only person she could confide in was Mark. It was still the early years for certain clinics, and many had protesters and others watching over them. She'd been concerned about going to one and being recognized. It was probably an unreasonable fear, but at that time she hadn't been thinking clearly. Mark convinced her to go to a less than reputable clinic which wasn't publicized, so there wouldn't be any questions asked and no trace of her decision. Like a fool, she agreed the procedure was successful, but the doctor had botched it and scarred her internally. Her chances now of having a baby were next to none. It was a secret she knew couldn't be hidden. She felt a tear begin to run down her cheek as she remembered the day a year later when she went to their family doctor to receive the report of what she already knew: she couldn't have children. She lied to Daniel and told him she'd had a procedure as a teen but never knew the damage it had done. It had almost crushed him. She remembered the tears in his eyes when he learned he would never be a natural father. It had been something he'd always dreamed of. They talked initially about adopting but had put those discussions on hold because of their careers. When they began talking about it again, fate intervened. She guessed it was karma, the universe trying to balance things out. They had vowed to put their affair behind her and Mark had agreed for the next 2 years. They successfully focused on being just platonic friends. It was a challenge, but they both succeeded in putting their respective relationships ahead of their past desires. Their hunger for successful careers had drawn them even closer as friends. Mark was beginning to jump up the ladder, 2 rungs at a time, and with his advice and encouragement, Eva had found her own career beginning to blossom as well. Neither of them could have predicted the future. Mark and Sophia had married a couple of months after the affair. It hadn't surprised Eva, since she knew that even in spite of their affair, Mark really did love Sophia. In many ways they were a good match. Mark was very dominant and her little sister had always been somewhat submissive. Only a year and a half into their marriage, Sophia fell into a deep depression. She had struggled with depression throughout her teenage years, but this was much more severe. She lost interest in everything around her and seemed to crawl back into herself. There was even a fear she might harm herself and had been put on suicide watch twice. She was eventually diagnosed with clinical depression. Her desire for intimacy had greatly diminished and the medication she was put on reduced it even further. Frustrated, Mark lamented about their lack of closeness to Eva. She foolishly tried to console him and soon they fell back into their affair while Daniel was out of town. Over the next 2 years their relationship blossomed into a true love affair. Their affair hadn't ended, even when Sophia had broken out of her depression and resumed a more active life with Mark. Nina's only defense was that she was in love with both men. During the affair, she hadn't denied Daniel anything, just the opposite. She tried to give him even more of herself. Her relationship with her sister was naturally a convoluted mess. She'd always been the dominant big sister, but now she had to deal with her guilt and shame without drawing unwanted attention. Things became more complicated when Sophia announced she was pregnant. Nina's initial reaction was very poor. It had been a mixture of jealousy and remorse, but Eva had been able to explain. It was due to her sadness at not being able to have children of her own. Her emotional dilemma was tearing her apart. Her overwhelming guilt at betraying both her husband and her sister had led her to the brink of confessing everything many times. Fate, however, stepped in again and this time twisted its cruel knife. Eva had recently begun her frequent traveling, even if it was only to smaller sites. 1 week she'd been in Chicago and Mark traveled sporadically, but happened to be in Milwaukee for a conference. At the same time, it had been a simple task for him to take an extra day and meet her in her hotel. And Mark had always been very discreet, taking extra steps to make sure no one discovered or even suspected their affair. Even when meeting out of town, They always acted as if someone could be watching to make sure no one saw him coming out of her hotel room in Chicago. Mark had left in the middle of the night. It wasn't until later that day she learned Mark had been a victim of a hit-and-run accident when he'd gotten back to Milwaukee. He was in critical condition at a hospital there. Eva shook her head slowly and gently sighed. Everything changed after that. Mark's world turned into a nightmare and threatened to drag her down with it. Eva had been horrified when she'd initially visited him physically. He'd been a mass of cuts, bruises, and broken bones. Eva knew those would fully heal. However, Mark had two other injuries that wouldn't. Tragically, he'd broken his back and was now partially paralyzed from the waist down. He'd also survived a very severe blow to his head as well. He'd been diagnosed as having a moderate traumatic brain injury. It wasn't noticeable, since it didn't affect his speech, but his memory was clouded at times and it caused him controlling his emotions. He'd spent the next 2 months in a rehab hospital when he was released. He wasn't the same man. Between the trauma from his accident and being confined to a wheelchair, Eva watched Mark as he emotionally ricocheted from being bitter to being angry to being depressed. The confident and even sometimes arrogant man who'd been her lover was now a shadow of his former self. Over the next few months, her pregnant sister hovered over him and Eva was forced to limit her involvement to that of a concerned sister-in-law. She painfully watched as her lover became more and more dependent upon his wife. She quickly recognized Mark's love for Sophia was growing stronger as a result as well. When Eva was eventually able to talk to Mark privately, they both agreed their affair had ended. They parted vowing never to tell their spouses about their indiscretions. Unfortunately, with his physical and emotional issues, Mark's career suffered dramatically. The company he worked for didn't abandon him, but his rapid advancement had left him with few friends and many enemies. It quickly became evident his upward mobility with the company had come to an end. That realization caused Mark to fall into an even deeper despair. He began clinging to Sophia like a drowning man holding on to a life preserver. It was frightening for Eva to watch as Mark faded away. The only good thing coming out of that nightmare was the one Shia was coming into her own. Still, by the time Eva was born, it was obvious that Sophia and Mark would need extra help with their insurance, money and savings. Along with Mark's large inheritance, they were able to buy the house across the street. Mark's parents had given them his inheritance early in order to financially take care of his needs that their insurance wouldn't cover. At first, Daniel visited daily. She would help Sophia take care of Eva in some of the household chores, while Daniel helped with those things around the house. Mark couldn't do anymore. Over the next 2 years, she watched Mark's personality weaken as her sister blossomed. Sophia was a natural, nurturing mother and wife and looked after Eva and Mark like a hawk. In some ways, Eva thought she was smothering Mark with her overprotectiveness, but the alternatives of having someone else watching over him weren't an option. Daniel was able to spend more time helping them since he began traveling less. Nina's career, however, was taking off and she began traveling much more. One of the side benefits was that her husband was getting to play Uncle Daniel with the baby. It was a benefit that helped Eva ease her conscience as she threw herself into her career. Eva was still ashamed, as she remembered how she'd spent less and less time around Mark. That last year he wasn't the man she'd fallen in love with, the man for whom she'd risked her marriage and relationship with her sister. He'd become sad and pathetic. She wasn't sure why she avoided him, but she suspected she'd finally begun to realize what a fool she'd been to think they were soulmates. As she increasingly stayed away from Mark and Sophia's home, She encouraged Daniel to spend more time over there when he wasn't traveling. It had given her a level of peace, knowing he was going over there in her place. In hindsight, it was probably unwise. She hadn't considered the effect of Mark seeing the man he'd cuckolded for years doing things around his home that he couldn't. It must have contributed to how things turned out. When she heard Mark had taken his own life, she was more sad and then surprised. Sophia was naturally distraught, first because she lost her husband and secondly because she just found out she was pregnant. Eva had been aware Mark's paralysis had affected his sexual performance, but was surprised to learn it hadn't affected his potency. At the time, Sophia had lamented that if her husband had known about the baby, he might not have killed himself. Eva seriously doubted that it had been obvious Mark hadn't been able to cope with not being the alpha dog in a dog-G-dog world. After Mark's death, both Eva and Daniel made sure Sophia and Eva were taken care of, even though Mark's life insurance wouldn't pay out because of his suicide. His inheritance allowed Sophia to stay home and look after her children for several years. It was initially discussed if Sophia and Eva should move in with them, but Eva wasn't high on that idea. With Mark gone, Eva was concerned Sophia and Daniel might get too close. She knew both of them were fond of each other, much like a brother and sister, and would never cross those boundaries. But there was no reason to tempt fate. By that time, Eva had poured herself into strengthening her marriage and was beginning to receive the benefits. Their life together was great and she and Daniel seemed to settle into a very comfortable career and no children marriage. Eva had wished those good things upon her sister as well. It was almost a year after Ryan was born, before Sophia began to date again, even if only rarely. Sophia was pretty and had become much more confident with motherhood, so it made sense she began looking for another husband at some time. The man she settled on had shocked Eva. His name was Alex and he lived in another state. Sophia had met him through a dating service. What had stunned Eva was that he was still married. Technically, he'd been separated from his wife for years, but he was still married. Added was the fact his status wasn't going to change anytime soon because of his young children and the family's legal and financial situations. Eva had been flabbergasted at the extent of the changes in her sister over the past few years. Her once timid and reserved sister was now colder and more aggressive. When she questioned Sophia about the obvious lack of a future her relationship with Alex held, her sister had informed her that because of his situation, she and Alex had agreed to have very limited interaction with each other's families. Besides, Sophia had explained Daniel was an outstanding male role model for Eva and Ryan. Anyway, Sophia had told her she was content to let Daniel continue to be their father figure while Alex took care of her other needs. Eva had reluctantly agreed, partially out of guilt and partially because Daniel absolutely adored his niece and nephew. That's when the cycle they'd been in for the last 15 years began. Sophia had a romantic interest on the side. Daniel got to play Addie with her kids and Eva got her husband and a great career. Most times when Sophia would go spend a weekend with Alex, either Eva or Daniel would agree to watch the children. It turned out to be Daniel more often than her, since her business travel kept increasing, but her husband didn't mind since it let him spend more time with Sophia's kids. Eva smiled to herself when she thought of Alex. She'd only met him a few times over the years, but she had to admit he was handsome, even if he was several years older than Sophia. Over the past 15 years it seemed they'd had a good, even if distant relationship. A deep, harsh stab of pain brought Eva back to the present. She grimaced until it passed. She and Daniel had a good life. They'd been happy and she'd done her best to be a good wife to him after Mark's death. She loved him with everything she had and had never strayed again, even with the numerous opportunities she'd had during her travels. She also knew he loved her. It was his love. She was counting on to allow him to somehow forgive her. Sister's forgiveness would be something else. The new Sophia would probably hate her. Initially, she was hoping her actions over the past 15 years would help. She also prayed blood would be stronger than the pain of her betrayal. She decided she'd tell them at the same time. Not only did she not have the strength to go through this twice, but she felt maybe they might find the strength to forgive her and each other. It wasn't the first time. The thoughts of her husband and sister eventually becoming a couple had crossed her mind. She wondered if they would ever dare to cross the boundary from their brother-sister relationship to a more romantic one after her death. Ava still wasn't sure what she thought about that. She was torn between her desire to make sure Daniel was taken care of after her death and the jealousy of thinking about her husband with another woman. Selfish to the end. She scolded herself. This will be my final penance, encouraging the two of them to step past the sibling barrier and seek each other out romantically. She knew her husband would be devastated by her death, so seeking solace in her sister's arms wasn't too much of a stretch. Sophia's relationship with Alex had cooled dramatically, it seemed. When all his children were old enough to leave home, he decided against pursuing his divorce. She hadn't spoken about Alex or gone to see him in over a year, a few months after Nina's cancer had been diagnosed. Since then, Sophia and the kids had spent a lot of time around Ava and Daniel. Ava was truly thankful, since been a godsend for both her and her husband. Daniel opened the bedroom door and cautiously entered. Over his shoulder came the voices of Han, Ava, and Ryan by Antiva. They called out from the other room, "Well, be back over in a little while." Han, Ava added later Daniel. They both chimed. As they closed the front door, Ava stifled a laugh. She knew her husband hated being called Daniel and corrected anyone who mistakenly called him that. Well, everyone except Han, Ava, and Orion them he'd never correct. It had been their pet name for him since they were little. Even Sophia had followed suit, calling him Daniel a couple of years later. She had asked her sister about it once years ago, and Sophia had told her she did it at first so as not to confuse her small kids at the time, but also to tease Daniel. Ava had understood and laughed, but had sworn to herself she'd never call him that to her. Daniel would always be her Daniel Topper. Her husband stood at the foot of her bed as her sister sat beside her and held her hand. She stared at them and smiled. Daniel was still nice looking and fairly fit. Even at 50, Sophia had blossomed into a very attractive woman and was still so even for a 48-year-old. I wanted to talk to you both before my situation deteriorates even more. It won't be long before I'll be struggling simply to talk or keep a coherent thought in my head, she said with a sad smile. Before that happens, I need to confess something to you both. Ava, please do not do this, said quietly, his voice full of emotion. She looked at him and her heart began to break. She always knew he'd suspected something between her and Mark, but those doubts had only first surfaced after Mark's death. She was sure he never confronted her, because he desperately loved her and knew Mark would never be a threat to him. She wondered if Mark had ever hinted at their affair. She dismissed the thought, since Daniel would have no doubt approached Sophia and Sophia would have certainly confronted her regardless. It had taken Ava years before she was confident. Daniel knew there was no one in her life but him. It had been done solely by action so as not to draw any unwanted attention. But over the years, Ava knew Daniel didn't doubt her love for him. Now, however, she could see the frustration building in her husband. He obviously wanted to avoid this. It was typical of him, since he disliked confrontation. Those times he would confront. He'd do it in a very cold, businesslike way. "I'm sorry, the video game sorry, sweetheart," she said, gently. "I need the truth to come out and I'm running out of time." "Please," Daniel said sternly. "Let the past stay in the past." "Daniel, I need to do this," she replied, trying not to sound condescending. "I don't want to leave this world with these secrets between the three of us. Damn it." "Ava," he snapped, "I'm begging you. Leave it alone." His emotional outburst took her back momentarily. Her need to unburden herself of her guilt, though, overrode his protest. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I can't do that." She looked over at her little sister and felt her heart tighten. Sophia's face was full of both dread and anticipation. Of course, Eva thought to herself. She isn't stupid either. Naturally, she'd suspected something as well. She gathered her resolve and continued. It was time. They say, the truth would set a person free. Eva prayed they were right. "I'm so very, very sorry." A vacay voice choked with emotion. "But I have to ask both of you for your forgiveness. Years ago I betrayed both of you. Over 20 years ago I had an affair with Mark." Eva thought she had prepared herself, but the pained looks on her sister's and husband's faces broke her heart. Sophia couldn't look at her and Daniel wouldn't take his eyes off of her. She didn't know which was worse. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to ask this," Eva said softly, with tears in her eyes, "but I hope you can find it in your hearts to somehow forgive me." Her husband stared at her with an expression that made her question whether she'd done the right thing by confessing. Her sister had released her hand and buried her face in her hands for several seconds. A terrible silence shrouded the trio. Then Daniel, calm voice, shattered the awkward silence. "Why, I'm sorry, Daniel," Eva said gently. "I wish my reasons were better, but they aren't. I was lonely and foolish. I thought I was in love with him. I knew it was wrong, but I thought he was my soulmate. That's not what I meant." Her husband responded coldly. "I meant, why are you doing this now? Why cause all this pain?" "I'm sorry, but I needed to do this. I needed to ask your forgiveness before it was too late." "What about our needs?" Daniel stated, his voice shaking with emotion. "What about what Sophia and I needed?" Eva helplessly stared silently at them. Sophia looked at her sister. "All I want to know is how," Sophia said, with tears running down her cheeks. "How could you do that to me?" Eva sighed deeply and wiped her eyes. "I'm sorry, Sophia. I had no excuse for being such a horrible sister. I can only say when we first got together. It was before you were married." Sophia hissed. "We were engaged, so he was already mine. Why would you need to take him away from me? Besides, you were married, weren't you?" "Yes," Eva whispered as she glanced guiltily over her husband. "I know you won't believe me, but I truly thought Mark and I were destined to be together. I knew our actions would hurt others, but I believed it was fate. I'm so very sorry." She looked back at her husband. It was obvious he was dealing with a mixture of anger and hurt. "I'm so sorry, Daniel, but it's true. I was in love with both you and Mark. I love you, Daniel, and I always have, but Mark was like my soulmate. Or at least I thought so at the time. As time went by, I realized Mark and I were more like kindred spirits. If I had learned that sooner, we could have remained only as good friends instead of lovers as it was. I ended up betraying both you and Sophia. I know it may not seem like it now, but I've always loved you, Daniel. Sophia snorted in disgust and Daniel sighed deeply. I believe you, he said solemnly, much to Eva's surprise. I believe you when you say you loved both of us, but I don't believe your love for Mark was love at first sight. It might have ended like that, but that's not how it started. A love like you're speaking of takes time to cultivate. It takes countless heart-to-heart conversations and multiple intimate moments to bond the hearts together like that, and that takes a conscious effort. It takes cold, calculated planning. The fact you decided to make the time to build a relationship with another man is something I found hard to forgive. It's certainly something I never forgot. Ava wiped the tears away and stared pleadingly at her husband. She nodded slowly. I felt like you suspected something a long time ago. I noticed it shortly after Mark's death. But Daniel, he was never a threat to you, and then, after his death, he wasn't even a part of my thoughts. And since then I've been a good, faithful wife. I've never strayed again, even though I've had countless opportunities while I was traveling. I never cheated on you, if you say so, he replied quietly. Since you've basically lied to me for the past 20 years by not confessing your affair, you'll understand why I'm having trouble believing you. But even if you've done what you say, it doesn't undo your affair with Mark. Now does it? Like I said, it was hard to forgive you, but I couldn't forget. What do you mean? Ava asked, her voice shaking. What I mean was that I knew about the two of you well before his death. I knew about your affair even before his accident. Please, if it were life, Daniel, Ava pleaded, please tell me you didn't have anything to do with Mark's accident. Well, I can truthfully say the importance of my role is somewhat subjective, depending on who's asking. I'd like to think my involvement is indirectly responsible for his misfortune. Oh, Daniel, how could you? Well, the same question could have been asked of both of you. What did Sophia, or I, ever do to deserve your betrayal? Ava was silent as her tears streamed down her face. Slowly her forehead pinched as the question formed in her mind. But how did you find out? I told him, Sophia interjected in a cold voice. Ava gasped. You knew? Yes, Sophia said, drying her eyes. But when Sophia looked over at Daniel, she appeared to be looking for a sign or some type of permission. Apparently she received it when Daniel grimaced and nodded. Well, Sophia continued, we decided not to air everything, hoping you would die in peace with your secrets. However, you chose to open Pandora's box, and I guess everything will come out. Now I'm sorry to start. I found out about you sleeping with my husband, only 1.5 years into my marriage. No, Ava gasped in horror. Oh God, no, why do you think I fell into such a deep depression? Sophia asked calmly. That's what happens when you find out two of the people you trust most in life are betraying you. Learning my husband had slept with my older sister while we were engaged almost crushed me. Ava buried her face in her hands and wept. I never knew. Of course you didn't. You were so damn selfish. It was always about you. Even when we were growing up, Sophia glared at her sister, waiting to see if there would be a response. When there wasn't, she continued, I came so close to giving up. Back then I was alone, since I was afraid to approach Daniel about it. The reason for my fear was because, if he already knew, I would have completely lost it. Having all three of the people I love the most betray me would have been too much. I tried to keep holding on to the fact that before we were married. It was weak, but at least it was something. I finally worked myself out of my depression and began to try to heal my marriage. Like a fool, I didn't confront the two of you at the time. Instead, I spent the next 6 months fighting to restore my marriage. Imagine my surprise when I found out my sister was sharing my husband's bed again. That's when I started leaving a small recorder in our bedroom, as well as in yours and Daniel's bedroom whenever he traveled. It didn't take long before I had the evidence of your affair. I was torn between despair and anger when I realized I'd been in competition with my sister for my husband's affections for the past 16 months. When I felt myself starting to fall back into my depression, I chanced confronting Daniel. I'm ashamed to say I was relieved when I found out he was as clueless as I'd been. I'd found an ally and it gave me the strength to hang on. Daniel was a godsend. With his friendship and support, I was able not to fall apart again. Nina's forlorn face began to give way to shock and realization. She stared at her husband and tried to stifle a sob. But what do you mean? You knew, even before she whispered. You never said anything. No, I started to. But Sophia reminded me of how unprotected I was, both financially and otherwise. It took a little while to get things maneuvered around, but I eventually got those things covered. I talked to a colleague from work who had gone through an ugly divorce recently, and he helped me set up an offshore account to begin dumping any loose or hard-to-trace funds into. When I was finished, I was ready to confront the both of you. But then Sophia stopped me. Stopped you. Eva said weakly. Confusion plainly written on her face. She turned and stared at her little sister. Why simple? Sophia replied, if we confronted you back, then there would have been 2 divorces. Afterwards, you and Mark would likely have gotten together, so the only ones really losing anything would have been Daniel and me. So I proposed an alternative to confronting you. Sophia looked over and sheepishly smiled at Daniel. He shook his head slowly and tried to hide a small grin. Eva stared at her husband in shock and horror. Sorry, sweetheart, Daniel said, his face starting to read but it was quite the proposal. If it makes you feel better, sister, Sophia interjected. Daniel really struggled with my proposition, at least initially, but when he heard some of my tape recordings of your meetings with my husband, he relented. I know hearing you profess your love for him countless times has kept some ember of hope alive within him, though I also know listening to you declare your love for my husband, as well as hearing other things, was the final blow. I'm certain that was what finally convinced him to accept my offer for a revenge affair. Eva lay there, her mouth opening and closing like a ended fish. Her mind raced as she began connecting the dots. Sophia continued as if she was reading a report in a staff meeting. What Daniel and I had back then was more of a friends with benefits type of relationship. I don't know how long it would have lasted, but then I ran into the same problem you did. I turned up pregnant and didn't know whether it was my husband's or my lover's child. Gasped. You knew, she whispered as the tears began streaming down her cheeks again. Yes, you made mention of it a few times during the recordings. Sophia explained. I was still very wary of how Mark might react. So when I mentioned it to him, I said there was a possibility I might be pregnant. He reacted very strangely, so a couple of days later I told him it was a false alarm. I saw him visibly relax when I said that he may have forgotten about his reaction, but I didn't. I called his mother later that week. Mark's parents were living in Canada at the time. His family was never close, but I asked her if she remembered if Mark liked children. She said she thought he did, but she doubted he'd ever agree to adopt any. She also said Mark had told them we'd already discussed all this before we were married. The fact was there wouldn't be any children since he was sterile. Hava gasped in horror. Yes, it seems he had complications with some childhood disease. But Ava stammered, her face growing pale. That would mean, yes, Daniel interrupted coldly. That would mean you ended our pregnancy to cover up your affair and your soulmate knew it wasn't his. No, God. No, Ava wailed. Oh God, please. No, she curled up into a ball and wrapped her arms around her frail legs. It felt like her heart was shattering and she was struggling to breathe. No, her heart cried out, but she knew it was true. How could Mark have done that to me? Oh God, what must Daniel think of me? He must have hated me. Ava fought to control her breathing. The tears streamed down her face as she stared silently at her husband with a look of abject shame. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't know that was the other thing. Daniel continued ignoring her last statement, which eventually drove me into Sophia's bed. Both Daniel and Sophia silently watched as Eva sobbed. A wide range of emotions danced across their faces. There was a mixture of pity and compassion, guilt and remorse, and even anger and pain. Daniel broke the uncomfortable silence by continuing, so then we had a problem. Sophia was actually in fact pregnant with Eva, and Mark would soon realize it. How he would react was a mystery, but it was certain it would be explosive, since everything was about to be exposed. That's when I made some decisions and made some calls. Mark eventually did confront Sophia and she countered by throwing his affair and his sterility back at him. She lied about who the actual father was and said it had been a one-time revenge thing. She also told him if he told anyone, she'd confront you and destroy any hopes of the relationship he dreamed of having with you. She also threatened to tell me and see if I wouldn't seek revenge and come after him. That bought us a little time. It wasn't much and obviously didn't stop him from continuing his affair with you, but then you both went to Pennsylvania. Then Mark had his accident and your affair was over. Eva K's eyes widened. You tried to have Mark killed, she choked. No, I actually asked that your affair be ended without you being physically harmed. The particulars weren't important. I was surprised when it happened, and even more so with the end results. How could you? Eva stammered. If you're asking how I could do something like that to that. Please, you've got to be joking. Let's see. He claimed to be my caring brother-in-law, was cheating on my sister-in-law, screwing my loving wife behind my back, and played a major role in ending our pregnancy. How could I not do something like that to him now? Can you understand why I had no problem if the piece had died or not? Eva closed her eyes, beginning to realize the repercussions her affair had on her husband and sister. It was her and Mark's betrayal that had damaged her husband and her sister, changing who they were. Daniel's calm voice awoke her from her epiphany. Now, if you're asking about the logistics, well, it wasn't difficult. I simply moved a little money from my offshore account and added it to a couple of prom to undercharge for services on specific construction projects to cover the cost. Eva looked so surprised. Every person who's ever been in construction has worked with people who claim to know someone who knows someone. The thing is, a few of them actually do. Sophia gently continued when Mark got out of the hospital. We all knew he wasn't the same. He was broken physically and fragile emotionally. He lied to my face and swore your affair had ended before he went to Milwaukee. He swore he wanted to work on our marriage if I terminate my pregnancy. I told him, since he was sterile, I was keeping the child but agreed to never tell anyone she wasn't his. I also told him if he ever told you, I'd do everything possible to ruin what was left of his life. You see, sister, he did love you, but I made sure to emphasize that you would never end up back with him once you learned of his part in your procedure. He asked me why I didn't want you or Daniel to know. I explained to him. If he told you, I'd be forced to confront both you and Daniel, and there was a good chance I'd lose both a sister and a brother-in-law. I told him it wasn't something I was willing to risk because I still needed you both. Reluctantly, he agreed. Afterwards, Daniel helped me to tie up our finances. We locked up most of Mark's and my money so he wouldn't be able to use it to threaten me in a divorce that started several months of hell, with us trying to determine if there was any reason to save our marriage. I know Mark still hoped there was, but I knew there wasn't. I was simply trying to figure out what to do next. Mark continued to slowly recover from his accident. It was very difficult for him, and he was frustrated as he watched my pregnancy continue after Eva was born. He struggled to even hold her. I think we both realized things would never be okay between us again. My problem was I couldn't get over his betrayal, and it was even worse since he'd done it with my sister. To make things even more complicated, I realized I had very strong feelings for your husband by that time. Our revenge affair had ended. After the accident, I wanted to continue, but Daniel still loved you, so we decided to work on our respective marriages. Until after Eva was born, things from our were quickly spiraling downward. His work started falling apart and our marriage was dying. He desperately tried to hang on, but it was a losing battle. Then, when Eva was about 5 months old, Mark figured out who the father was. Maybe it was the way Daniel looked at Eva or the way I looked at Daniel, but Mark noticed and connected the dots. It was then that Mark made a huge mistake. He confronted both of us and threatened to tell you. I'm not sure if it was his ego, his anger, or just plain stupidity, but he began trying to hurt Daniel by taunting him. He was bragging about his part in your procedure. Whatever small restraint Daniel still had up until then completely disappeared. That was the night Mark almost drowned in our bathtub. We told everyone Mark had tried to stand and accidentally fallen, but the truth was Daniel dumped him out of his wheelchair into the tub. Nina stared in disbelief that her gentle husband could be so violent. Daniel looked very uncomfortable as he looked guiltily back at his cheating wife. I'm not very proud of my actions back then, he said softly, looking embarrassed. I was filled with a rage. I'd always tried to hide from you, but Mark unleashed it that night. Thank God Sophia was there. She was screaming at me not to kill him. As I held his head under the water, she finally got me to come to my senses, or I probably would have killed him. Once she got through to me, I pulled him out of the bathtub. He was choking and gasping and crying. I told him one word from him and I'd finish this and make sure it looked like his other accident. I could see in his eyes the realization of what I just said, and I'm sure he knew I would make good on my threat. After that, things got pretty strange. Eva said in a stunned voice, "What do you mean strange?" Well, Daniel started after that. What he's trying to say, Sophia interjected calmly as we restarted our revenge affair, only this time I flaunted it in Mark's face. Sophia, you didn't. Eva gasped. I sure as hell did. You know he deserved it. You both did. But Daniel still loved you and was protecting you. So all my rage and pain were aimed at my cheating husband. He begged and pleaded with me to stay, but I told him he cheated on me for years and I planned to continue for a while. I told him at the end of that time I'd stop and would decide if either of us wanted to try and save whatever was left of our marriage. I truly believed that hope was the only thing he was hanging on to those last few months. Unfortunately, when I told him I was pregnant again and Daniel was the father he knew we were over. Yes, he did know about Ryan. About a week after I broke the news to him, he needed for me to take Ava with me to the store and took his own life. If he hadn't, I'm not sure how our lives would have been different. For Sophia's part, Daniel added, we made sure she and the kids were taken care of. We unfroze her family finances, including Mark's inheritance, which was originally intended for his long-term care. Added to those were the funds I was diverting into my offshore account. Combined, it easily allowed her to stay home with the kids for many years. How did I divert the money? Well, that was actually pretty easy. With both of our salaries, we certainly weren't hurting financially, so there was never a good reason for you to look too closely. I didn't touch any of your individual investments, but filtered most of mine, along with any bonuses and raises, into my offshore account. You were so focused on your career, you never really asked why my raises and bonuses were so low when Ava and were old enough to go to school. I arranged for Sophia to be hired as a consultant by one of the companies it worked with. It gave her flexible hours using her degree, and since her pay was supplemented by my offshore account, it was equivalent to a full-time salary. Between that and their inheritance, they were set for life. My turn, Sophia interrupted. She cleared her throat and threw a sweet smile at Daniel. He snorted a muffled laugh and acquiesced with my money. Matters being taken care of. Sophia began softly. It allowed me to focus on the disaster that was my private life. Things became very complicated during my pregnancy with Ryan. Besides, my feelings for Daniel began to change towards me. It wasn't a revenge affair anymore. Daniel had begun to care for me more than as a friend. Ava quickly looked back and forth between her sister and husband. Her question was obvious. It was on the tip of her tongue, but she was terrified to ask it. You see, sweetheart, Daniel said gently, I really do understand when you said you were in love with both Mark and me. I found doing the same thing. Of course, I would have never allowed myself to fall in love with Sophia if I hadn't learned about your cheating first. Regardless, I was now faced with a dilemma. I was beginning to care deeply for Sophia, but I still loved you, even though you torn out my heart with your affair. I wasn't ready to quit on us and throw you away. Vava gasped at the bluntness of his statement. She never really seriously considered the possibility Daniel would have divorced her if her affair had been exposed. Those thoughts had always been quickly dismissed in her mind. Daniel's voice drew her attention back to the present. I think it was hearing you confess your love for me, even while you were cheating. That gave me some twisted hope our marriage was worth salvaging. Unfortunately, there was no way I'd ever leave Sophia or the kids either. It wasn't ideal and was probably even cowardly, but I chose to solve the problem by doing nothing. I continued to love you both. I can't explain it, but I've always been so very grateful that Sophia seemed to accept my feelings at first. I expected she'd go find someone else after Ryan was born, someone who could love her exclusively. Oh, I tried. Sophia laughed. Sadly, I tried, but my heart kept bringing me back to Daniel. So after a year I told Daniel I'd take whatever part of him he could give me. That's when we came up with Alex. Daniel added Alex. Ava asked quietly. Alex wasn't real. Oh, Alex was real, Daniel said, smiling. He was a client of mine from Boston. He owed me a favor and was willing to act like Sophia's boyfriend the rare times he was in town visiting my company. I know he and his husband thought it was hilarious, him pretending to have a girlfriend. But your visits, Ava whispered, obviously both physically and emotionally spent. On those occasions, Daniel was out of town and you were watching the kids. I would join Daniel wherever he was and we'd spend some quality alone time. More often than not, though with those shows of the video game Slipknot, Daniel would come over and we'd spend time as a family. The children, Ava stammered. The children knew, Sophia replied softly. Oh, they knew Daniel was acting like a father. They even began calling him Dad. We quickly put a stop to that by having them call him Daniel instead. So every time one of them called him Daniel, it was like them calling him Dad. Ava felt her stomach roll and felt very nauseated. She briefly considered the irony that was playing out before her. She wanted to scream, but was too weak, so she watched in horror as the train wreck that was her marriage continued to derail. As they got older, Sophia continued, they suspected our family wasn't like most. I told them Daniel was their father and you and I were like the mothers that worked for many years until they became teens. Even though they'd already guessed it, we told them the entire truth after their 18th birthday. Surprisingly, neither had as many issues as we fear, since Daniel had always been their dad. Anyway, how long did your affair last? Ava said weakly. As she gathered herself, Sophia stared at her dumbfounded. Daniel sighed deeply. Ava, he said gently, it never ended. My love for Sophia is just as strong, if not stronger, than it was all those years ago. In fact, not to be callous, but we plan on marrying. After your death, the kids are looking to legally change their last names as well. I'm sorry. Ava, we really had planned on not telling you. We hoped your passing would be as peaceful as possible. Now that doesn't seem likely. Nina, Sophia interjected, I still loved you, even with your betrayal. My betrayal is horrible. You asked if I could forgive you, and the answer is yes, but I couldn't forget. Because of that, I justified the things I did back then, things I'm ashamed of. I'm ashamed of how my relationship with Daniel began, but not for how much I love him now. I love you, Nina. Even with what you did, I still love you. I also love Daniel. In the end, I loved you both enough to share him with you, just like you said earlier. Ava, Daniel added gently, I love you both. I hope you've had a good life, one full of love and success. I've tried to support your desire for a career and make you feel loved over the years. You asked us to forgive you earlier, and I can honestly say we have, but your affair changed the dynamics of our marriage dramatically. Now the question is, can you forgive us? Ava sat stunned. Her world, as she'd known it, was crumbling down around her. Things she'd once believed were unshakably true were false. Her heart raced and her breathing was labored as she struggled to wrap her mind around what she'd been told. Then she heard Daniel's soft voice drawing her attention. However, she looked up and stared at her husband and sister. Daniel stood behind Sophia and wrapped his arms around her as her sister wiped any remaining tears from her eyes. Although he continued, I'm sorry you wouldn't listen and chose to all of this. We had hoped to avoid all of this, Even so, we realize we've had 20 years to learn to forgive you. Have less than a few weeks. We're going to go into the living room and let you think." Sophia stood up and began to follow Daniel out of the room. The fact they were holding hands wasn't lost on Ava. Sophia turned back toward her bed and sister. "Call us if you still need to talk," Sophia said, sadly, "or if you come to any decisions." Held up into a bowl and wept. Her soul seemed to have been torn out of her body by the pain in her heart. This wasn't the way she expected things to go. The truth, in all its ugliness, was exposed. The dying woman was now faced with a harsh dilemma. Could she forgive those who she just asked to forgive her? Even more distressing was the realization that in a week or two, it wouldn't even matter. Thanks for joining us for this intense and heartbreaking story of betrayal and hidden secrets. As the truth comes to light, it leaves us wondering, could you forgive those who have hurt you so deeply, especially when time is running out? Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe, comment, and bookmark. We will provide you with more high-quality audio videos on the topic of infidelity.